Words escape me today, so today will be fun.
Words fail. Words fail. Okay. Welcome back to the To Be Read podcast. I'm Julie.
And I'm Vanessa. And today we're talking all about villains, our favorites who we love to hate, some complex characters. But first and foremost, let's say happy Halloween, because that is coming up in a few days. And that is what inspired our villains episode.
I love Halloween so much.
You know, I'm not a Halloween person either.
I hate it.
Oh, kids will kind of bring it out in me. I will say, like, I was so not that person up until I had a kid. And then I was like, oh, but she likes it, so we'll go do the pumpkin patch things. I do like a cozy vibe though. I like the pumpkin patch. I like the fall walks. I
don't think I can describe
cinnamon.
A pumpkin patch as cozy.
If you like cozy vibes, great. I'm not into spooky vibes though. But what I will say, I do get excited about like a good villain. So sometimes villains can intrigue me, and there's no story without a villain. So
it's true. They are a necessity.
Yes. And they take many forms, like many shapes, and they're not always a person. They're sometimes an entity. They're sometimes a circumstance. And so we're going to dive in. But first, we are going to do a little cheeky check-in on what we are reading. And because it's been a while.
Yeah.
Since
we haven't talked about it.
What you reading, Jewel?
So I last night just finished The Dagger and the Flame, which is a new release from Catherine Doyle, a new series. I actually got it from Book of the Month. When my options came up, I was like, I don't know. But this one was described as like an enemies to lovers romantasy. In like this, it's very Parisian, kind of gave like old, like Les Mis type setting vibes.
Okay.
Cool magic system. I really liked it.
Okay.
It was a little slow at the first, but really picked up. Really enjoyed that. And the audiobook is good too. I listened to it a little bit. So I just finished that, and now I'm reading The Games Gods Play by Abigail Owens.
Which, when you told me that, I was so jealous because that was on my TBR. And I literally, what did I say? I said, how are you starting that before me?
Yeah. It just kind of jumped into my hand. So I have Libro FM, which is a lot like Audible, but they also support local bookstores. And I had 2 credits, and I was like, what am I going to get? I don't know. And that book has come up, like I think it came up at Book Club a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago is when I heard about it. And then you bought it at Barnes & Noble one day, and I was like, oh, and then I saw it on Kindle Unlimited. So I grabbed it. But then I also got it on the audiobook. So I started listening to it today while I was binding books, and it's a good listen.
Listen, I'm in my audiobook era. Like, I hate it when people are like, you didn't really read it. And I'm like, listen, this is how I ingest information. Just let me be. That kind of goes into what I've been reading. So I trudged away on All the Young Dudes.
Yeah.
I did that via audio because it fit really well into my workplace environment where I could have it on, and if I kind of like, if my mind wandered for a minute, then I could come back, and it wasn't because of the pacing of it all.
Yeah.
It was a great experiment on the character development.
Yeah.
I've read a few things. I read Long Live Evil, which was interesting. And I read that in preparation for this particular podcast episode. And I'll kind of get into that in a minute. I read The Road of Bones by Demi Winters. That was on my TBR. I loved it. It was really good. And I thought the second book, because it also brings in some more characters, like how One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns does. I thought I wasn't going to like it because I didn't like Two Twisted Crowns as much as I liked One Dark Window, but I actually am finding, and I'm not quite done with it yet, but The Kingdom of Claw is the second one. That's what I'm reading now. And I really, really enjoy it. There's Demi Winters does a really good job at including diversity in her characters, and as well as some hard life things. Like one of her characters is agoraphobic. And this is like Viking fantasy too, you know?
Interesting.
So it's a kind of interesting spin. And then one has like a substance abuse problem. So it's a very interesting.
Kind of nice to bring that into fantasy. I feel like it can ground it in certain ways.
Going back to Long Live Evil, that is a very, I don't know if it's an indie read or not, but it's about this girl who has cancer. And it's not like A Walk to Remember, okay? It's about a girl. She's like kind of on her deathbed, and like this magic lady comes and she's like, would you like a second chance? Go into the book and get this thing and you can keep living type of situation. So she goes into the book, but she gets placed, and it's her and her sister's favorite book. And I highlighted so many passages at the beginning chapters because it's her and her sister talking about how much they love books, and it just reminded me of like yours and my conversations. And I was like, this is so cute. And then she goes into the book, but then she gets put as the bad guy, as the villain.
Oh,
but she already knows how the story is going to unfold. And because she makes different choices and things like that, the good guy turns into the bad guy, and it's like a whole thing. And that book was really weird. I gave it a 3 stars, but I think it was so creative.
We love creativity.
So I don't know if I'd keep going with it, but it got me thinking about villains and what really makes a villain and what makes people like villains. So, where to start?
Do you have a top, like, who is your all-time fave villain?
Oh, I don't have a top.
Who's your top tier villain? Do you have one that, like, you just, villain? Like, the worst of the worst?
Umbridge.
1000%.
Umbridge is a very interesting villain because she's not the main villain, but she is the one everyone hates the most.
She almost makes Order of the Phoenix, like, unbearable to reread. Like, it's painful on the reread because Dolores sucks so much.
There's a lot of different characters like her throughout books in general. Like we talked about, Ianthe was kind of like Umbridge. The situation of like she's just everyone hates her.
She is an Umbridge. She sucks. I think what makes Dolores unbearable though is like her like like her like the pink, the fluffy, the cats, just like the I'm not doing anything wrong. Like Ianthe, you kind of like see it. There's just something about Ianthe that's just off from the get-go. And Dolores is off too, but Dolores just has this like looks down at you. She's got that boomer energy that just like she is a Karen. Like but like a conniving, she's smart about the way she goes about things because she's able to like work her way into power by like making all these little adjustments at the ministry. And
I mean, it's been a while since I've read Harry Potter. Okay. So, but that's literally my go-to when I think of villains. It's like Umbridge and Voldemort. Those are my two probably. And it's just crazy to me that people hate her more than they hate Voldemort. And it's because people can not understand where Voldemort comes from, but there's like a backstory. You just hate Umbridge.
Umbridge was just born a wench.
Yeah. She was just not great.
Like, she was born 50 years old. She didn't
just
have
popped
a childhood.
Out of the womb.
She's just
a cat in one hand,
a fluffy pink teacup in the other. No, Umbridge is terrible. She's always the one that like pops right into my mind as well. I just hate her so much.
When I got on social media to ask people like what they thought was like a good villain, Umbridge was there. And so I don't know. She's just awful in every way, shape, and form.
Horrible human being. Voldemort they're just like letting a teenager ruin his life, you know? I saw a really funny meme yesterday that was like, at least Voldemort waited until the end of the school year to attack Harry. Like, at least he cared about his education.
Wait until the end. That's funny. I think giving a backstory to a villain can really expand upon the story and to make it just that much better. Sometimes you hear villains' origin stories per se, and it makes you just like really like them, but they're obviously the villain. The Darkling in Shadow and Bone is a prime example of that. In fact, people went feral over Ben Barnes in the TV show version. Well, granted, it's Ben Barnes, so like he just played the villain so well. Lee Bardugo gave him such an interesting backstory that you could empathize and sympathize, and you really had to think your stance on things. So that was really cool to see that unfold. And he really, really wanted to like rule with Elena. So
if I remember correctly, because as you know, Leigh Bardugo and I don't get along.
Right.
I have respect for her as a master of her craft. But he you're not sure at first if he's the villain, right? You're kind of like, what's this? What's happening? And then you're like, oh, he bad.
Yeah. That brings up another type of villain, and the villain that doesn't start out to be the villain. Peter Pettigrew.
Peter Pettigrew.
Yeah, so he was James's best friend and turns on him.
He was all their
worst.
best friends and he betrayed them. You don't really know until if you read all the young dudes, then you're like, you really see his evolution.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes sense. Like, I don't know. He was just never really in part of the, like, he was never
the cool kid.
He was never the cool kid. He was always just kind of like hanging around. He had like a pure blood background. He was just kind of there.
He reminds me of those people who hang around other people just to soak in, like just to try and get a little bit of their sunshine.
Yeah.
And he wanted to like have his own sunshine, and obviously
I just don't think that he was ever like, he ever realized who he was. He never just like let himself be himself. He was always trying to be somebody else.
Yeah.
It's like, I saw something though on TikTok, but it was talking about how, do you think Voldemort called Wormtail for the rest of the time just to like rub it in every single time he said that name, that he betrayed his friends?
That's really sad.
Isn't that? But just to think of like Voldemort just like rubbing salt in the wound every time he's just like, Wormtail.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. That's really sad.
Isn't that so sad?
Oh, I don't like that. Tamlin in ACOTAR. He's not the main villain, but he is a villain.
We did go on Tamlin defense.
We did
last week in the podcast.
We did. That was Team Tamlin.
Tamlin defense podcast. But he does become the villain.
Yep.
Not like the big bad villain.
Right.
I'm not quite sure. Like, Hybern is not the big bad in those books.
Who is?
I don't know, but Hybern's dead.
In the third book, he dies.
He dies. I guess that wraps up that little bit of a trilogy, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So,
I just don't feel like those books had a strong villain.
I agree. And that's what I was going to talk about is I feel like that I hated the Adder more than I hated the King of Hybern.
That freaking gargoyle.
The freaking gargoyle. A little spoiler for Red Rising is Cassius Bologna. He starts as a friend and becomes the villain. Not the main villain, but a villain. A villain.
That was a hard turn in that book. When Cassius finds out what happened and he takes him out to the wilderness
and tries to kill him. Yeah.
Tries to kill him. I was just like, ooh, that hurts. That hurts.
Like, it makes sense. If someone killed my brother, it's not like I'd be chummy with them anymore. They're never ever the main villains. It feels like they're always like on that side, but they just.
It was so interesting while putting notes together for this episode just to realize like all the different levels of villains. Like you kind of have like the overarching villain, but then you kind of have these like spikes of little villains. And sometimes the spikes are like a person. Sometimes they're an experience. Sometimes they're like an emotion or like just like a situation that they kind of have to get through. But it's just like you have the overarch and then these little spikes.
Yeah.
And just how much is mixed in there.
Yes. A great example of an overarching villain versus like a situational villain was in Throne of Glass.
Yeah.
Maeve and Erwin. I don't know if I could tell which one was the worst.
I'm just laughing because I've always said his name Erwan, like that grocery store in LA with like the $30 smoothies.
Maybe that's what it is.
I don't know. That's just like how I always said it was just like Erwan.
Maybe.
It just makes me laugh.
Those two are kind of both tied, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of a weird, they're both big bad animals, but having the overarching villain and then sometimes a situational villain happens quite often, especially in fantasy, but I feel like those overarching villains have henchmen.
Yes.
And I think the henchmen are so funny to me, but like the Adder in ACOTAR, which was a very scary thing, especially to Feyre, because a lot of her trauma came from the Adder, which is kind of a weird thing. Gollum.
Yes. Gollum is a tragic villain.
Yes.
He's a victim of circumstance.
Poor guy.
And his desperation in the end, I was really sad when he died. And I look back and I'm just like, he had the most tragic story. There's so much depth to him as a character. And you see this in the movies because I feel like they personify the kind of like the schizophrenia of it all, of like the Gollum versus the Smeagol. And it's just so sad, especially the beginning of Return of the King when you really get his backstory of what happened with Deagle. Yeah. I was like 10 years old and like obsessed with this like
this creature.
Creepy creature. Talking about Lord of the Rings.
Jack Barlow. I'm so sorry. He's a secondary situational.
Jack Barlow.
I'm so sorry.
We'll remember that in just a second.
Okay.
But with your overarching villains, so Sauron is our overarching villain in Lord of the Rings.
Right.
We've got, but then you have little villains along the way. And some of them are like big, like pretty big deals. But every situation has to have its opposition.
Right.
Right. So you could even classify Boromir for a time as a villain due to his own circumstance of like fighting with power. You know, we want this power for Gondor, but this power needs to be destroyed because it's too great. But he does get in the way of the Fellowship. I think he does kind of create issue there and ultimately is redeemed by the end. But he is kind of like a minor, but he's like a spike, a villain spike, you know?
Well, that kind of leads to a different type of villain, which is a circumstantial villain, like not necessarily a person. Sauron was not an actual like being to me. It was like an entity.
Yes.
And so power was kind of like the entity that was corrupting people. And so like, I don't know what I was thinking, but I remember comparing like drugs to power like that in my head when I was a teenager. So you read the Blue Sisters?
Blue Sisters.
And one of them is into drugs.
Quite a few of them are actually.
Oh,
it's a story about familial addiction, really.
Okay.
And so drugs do play a big part. They're kind of the villain. And we see a lot more of these, like, not people, but things being the villains in like lit fic and contemporary. So like I was thinking about all of my favorite books, and I have a section on my bookshelf of like my lit fic favorites. So I've got like Bridge of Clay in there, and I would say like the villain in Bridge of Clay is grief. I'd say like the all consuming grief is the villain in that story. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, I'd say in that one is time and change, because it's the story of a relationship evolution over a period of time, a long period of time, and time and change. They change the characters. They, you know, that has a big effect. That's kind of the villain of the story.
Lessons in Chemistry. I wrote men,
and I wrote misogyny.
That I love that book. But it is very much men in the time of the 60s. It's not necessarily like men now or anything, but
it's men now.
Well, in the book, it's men in the 60s, and what women had to face, especially coming from someone who was so analytical as she was, to not want to get married and to not want some of the things that she was told you have to have. And she had a family without a husband and without the father to her child and stuff like that. So she went through a lot of stuff, and I do think grief hurt her in that way as well. But yeah, men. And there was still villains, right? There was the, was it the producer or like there was still like a person, but it was representing an issue.
It creates a powerful conversation in even today's society.
Yeah.
I think it helped me kind of wake up and realize, because I've hardly been in a workplace. And so there's just a lot of things that I would just be like, oh yeah, whatever. But like, there's so much that does happen that we just don't realize. Yeah. And I think it's important to know that happens to people.
When I read it, I actually related to a lot of the stuff. Like where I work now is amazing, and it's a woman-led company, and there's no room for any of that riffraff. But I've worked at other places where that hasn't been the case, and it's like, you don't know anything because you're a woman, and you're just like, excuse you.
Yeah.
You see this degree?
It's a great commentary.
Accolades? Yes.
On society today. And it was just like not anything that I was expecting, but one of like the best books I've ever read. Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano is a retelling of Little Women. in a sense.
Oh.
It's such a good book. I think it has a lot of like villains in it, but I'd say like, I just wrote down life because I just think the choices that other people make and the effect that they have on you. Mm-hmm. I think mental health is another one in that one.
Okay.
But yeah, those are ones that sit on my shelf. And I was just like, these are ones that the villains are not actually people. They are things.
I think those can sometimes be tones in a fantasy world. Like the Road of Bones, one of the characters has a substance problem, but it's never like they always have a bad guy. So some of that is according to the genre.
Yeah.
There's not a ton of fantasy out there that is just circumstantial.
Yeah.
There's definitely like an entity or a person that is the bad guy, but your contemporary and lit fics are definitely more circumstantial, lifetime grief.
American
like
Dirt by Janine Cummins is a story of a woman and her son that live in Mexico City that are fleeing to cross the border to escape drug cartels. And I think it is necessary reading.
Really?
For everybody, especially in the United States. As we face immigration policy and issues that we're facing today, I think it's a very important read to help. It really opened my eyes. I feel like the immigration conversation is just always cheapened by stereotypes and racism. And we don't realize what truly pushes people to leave where they come from. And in this, it was the story of leaving and getting away so they could be safe. But there was also people that were leaving and fleeing because their homes were not habitable anymore due to weather changes and heat and stuff like that. But then in that story, you have the villain who is like the drug cartel guy. But then you also have other things in there like racism, immigration law, corruption, government, all of those kinds of things that were,
I think,
at play.
A good book will make you think about a couple of different things. It's not one note. You think about many different facets of what's happening. And life is rarely defined by one decision. It's a multitude of decisions. So that's a good segue into that. Like there are lots of things that come into play, but all of the best books that I've ever read have multiple things. They have like maybe an overarching villain, but then there's, in Red Rising, a common theme is the burden of leadership and the balance of like relationships with your subordinates and stuff like that. And so there's many different facets to the emotional character development that sometimes villains bring out.
One book that I was thinking of that I thought was very multifaceted in its villainry was Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead, which is a story of children. They're bringing these children up into space stations to train them to fight against the buggers. And in that story, I think you have multiple villains being the adults that are bringing these children into a war space. You have the bullies in the war, in the space station that are bullying Ender and his friends. But really the overarching villain in that book is Peter, Ender's brother, who is writing back home and kind of like creating friction in order to start a civil war. And I just feel like there were so many different facets of villains in that book that it was really interesting to think about as I was preparing for this episode.
I think facet is a nice word to use for villainry.
I think we just made a new word.
Villainry. I love it. And the reason being is because there are people or there are villains out there who start out as, friends and turn to villains, but then there's also people who are villains and turn to friends. Snape.
We got to talk about Snape. This is kind of a hard one just because it is very multifaceted, but it's also a series for children. So I think the same thing could be argued for Albus Dumbledore. We could talk about him from a villain standpoint as well because of what he put Harry through. I don't believe that Snape could be fully redeemed at the end.
Okay.
I just think that his actions throughout the whole series were so abhorrent, and he put Harry and his friends through hell. Like we've been listening to the books as a family, and the things that Snape says to them as children, like he was so verbally abusive to then just be like, oh, well, I was Dumbledore's right-hand man and I loved your mom and your dad saved me one time, but I'm going to be an asshole.
Always.
Like, I just don't think that erases his assholery at the end.
I think the movies glamorized him because he wasn't as awful in the movies, I thought. Maybe it was just because it was Alan Rickman, you know? Like,
we love him.
I don't, like I said, I need to reread them. It's been a while since I've like remembered everything, but what I do remember, yeah, he was not great. He was
at the
awful.
same time, you can argue for the sake of I was a double agent this whole time. Like at the end of the day, I was trying to protect you and was maybe too convincing. At times I was the bad guy, but
yeah,
he was never doing this because he liked James or he liked Harry.
It wasn't ever for James or Harry.
It was so that he could stay in Dumbledore's good graces and prove that he was loyal to him. And I think it angered him that when he found out that Dumbledore was basically raising Harry as a lamb for slaughter to die at the proper moment. And like, I get chills talking about it because like, no one saw it coming. Right? Like no one saw it coming. I just can't believe that he was fully redeemed at the end. And I struggle with the fact that Harry named his kid after him.
I also struggled with that because there's so many other people that fought in that war.
Hagrid. Justice for Hagrid. He's our Barb.
The Barb effect.
He's the Barb situation.
Oh, goodness. There are a slew of characters like Snape, though. Villains who are morally gray, for sure. You don't exactly know which side they're on until you do, until like the end. Usually the climax of the story, that's when it happens. A good example of this is One Dark Window. You don't know that the monster that lives inside of her head is actually there to protect her and is good. Because when you say that there's a monster in your head, like that doesn't bode well, you know?
No, and he was terrible.
Yeah.
Like the things that he said and the way that all wraps together at the end. So good.
So excited.
I need to reread One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns, but I loved the way that came together at the end. And the part that the nightmare played.
Sometimes what you think is bad is not always bad for you.
Yeah.
And that was a good example.
And even you just saying that makes me have a little more like grace for Snape because he really was pivotal in a lot of moves for the Order. And he did play his part well and convincingly and was a key in order for them to win in the end.
Yeah.
And so then I can turn around and respect him. I have just like I don't know. I like go back and forth on Snape all the time. Kind of like I do with Dumbledore.
I go back and forth on Dumbledore.
And I think
after I read 5 and 6, I was just like,
But I think that's what makes them such incredibly just like beautiful characters.
Yeah.
They're so complex. They're so multifaceted. They're just like, they're gray. They're gray. And that can be kind of like enraging sometimes.
Oh, let's talk about gray. Draco in Manacled, not Harry Potter, sorry. We're going to switch a little bit and go into Manacled.
Yes.
Which is a fanfic for Harry Potter.
Though I will say Draco is straight asshole 1 through 5.
In Harry Potter.
Draco in 6 and 7 kind of becomes a tragic villain. He's no longer just like the bully. He becomes like, again, he becomes
Regulus.
a victim of circumstance. He becomes the boy who had no choice because of his family. And he was punished for the crimes of his family, of his dad in particular.
Yes.
So I would go on to say that in 6 and 7, Draco becomes the victim of circumstance villain. But then you get into Manacled and you've got full on gray, morally gray Draco, and it is spectacular. And I was not going to bring up Manacled, but you brought it up, so let's talk about it.
I love how pumped you are. So for anyone who hasn't read Manacled, Manacled is also another fanfic, but it is an extraordinarily popular fanfic for Harry Potter. It has recently been picked up by a publisher and will be reworked to be published.
It's coming out in 2025 under the title Alchemized.
Sinlin Yu. That was my first fanfic I ever picked up, and I didn't love it like you love it. But what I could really respect is the multifaceted character that was Draco Malfoy, because he starts out as the bad guy because Hermione can't remember anything. And then she starts a big chunk of that book is her memories coming back to her. And then she realized that she has rapport and she has a relationship with Draco. And then it all comes back to her.
The way that fanfics are kind of done is like, there's some that are kind of canon compliant or they kind of follow the story.
Like all the young dudes.
Yes, very canon compliant. I don't know if people would say that Wolfstar is canon compliant. I think it is.
Okay.
That's a personal belief. But Manacled is an alternate universe fan fiction where Voldemort wins. So Voldemort wins and pretty much all the good guys die. And then
it's very graphic.
It is. There were like 2 or 3 times in that book where I was like, what?
It's like Game of Thrones.
But in that, you see all the ups and downs and all the grays of even Hermione too. And it becomes a big issue within the order of like, I don't think we can defeat the evil with Stupefy and Expelliarmus. Which, thank you for bringing up that issue that haunts my dreams as I read Harry Potter. Draco is just so intriguing in that. And honestly, Draco in most of the fanfics is very intriguing because of his grayness, because of his background, because of where he comes from and the things that he has done.
One thing that was extraordinarily hard, this is a spoiler for Manacled, so skip ahead a minute or so. If you haven't read it and you do want to read it. So the hard part for me with Manacled is he rapes her. And I don't know how else to say it because she doesn't have her memory. So she doesn't know that they had a relationship, that she loves him, but he had to do what he had to do. Right. Like that was, there's no winning in that situation. There was no winning for Draco. And you could see that because he like went and vomited right after. And like, I felt really bad for him once I like read all the memories and stuff. But like that, he is the epitome of morally gray. Cause sometimes people will be like, he's morally gray. And I'm like, no, he's not. He's just got an attitude problem or something, you know, like, like some people will just do every MMC as morally gray. And I'm like, no, just because they'll kill someone else for the FMC does not mean they're morally gray. Sorry, it doesn't. Not in a fantasy
that's
world.
Another one of those like silly like trope hooks that they try to get you with of like morally gray.
Yeah.
It's just
Enemy
like
syllabus.
Describe morally gray. Like, is he obliterating people, dissolving them because he's trying to protect her? Or is it just like, get your hands off my woman?
With Draco, I felt he was one of the true morally gray characters in Manacled. And to see it all get tied up at the end, or like, I guess it's probably around 70% that they come back into the story after the memories, that was heartbreaking. So I do feel bad for Draco, both in the Harry Potter franchise and for him in Manacled, especially in that particular fanfic.
Yeah, because when you think about a 12-year-old and 13-year-old saying such horrible things, you know it's because of what is being said to him at home. You know, like as someone who has children and they are starting to repeat things that are like said to them by kids at school, it's just like, oh, like we are all kind of, you know, what we spend our time around is what we can become.
Nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thing to think about. One thing, you know, that Draco kind of brings up, especially in Manacled, is there are stories where the main characters are the bad guys. And a good one is Diana in the Book of Azrael is a villain, like a true villain. She is not great. And she is only really the villain because she has made a deal with like the god of monsters or something like that. And she has to do his bidding. Otherwise he'll hurt her sister. So she's living for one thing and that's her sister. And that's beautiful. And that gives a backstory, but she's a villain, like the stuff she does. It creates a multifaceted character because she's likable. Obviously she's the FMC, but she's still the villain. Very interesting thing that I hadn't read before.
Yeah.
That book. And maybe that's why I liked it so much, is it was surprising in its likability.
Suzanne Collins in the Hunger Games trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
And even her prequels, I think, has done an incredible job at giving her characters more depth and I thought President Snow was a fantastic overarching villain. He just has some of that charisma and that charm to like suck people in and think that what they're doing and believing is right. And then to, kind of stick the knife and dagger in the heart. I really liked him. I loved what Suzanne Collins did with A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which
I haven't read that one. I saw the movie, but I haven't read that one. It can be
slow. Like, I don't think it's a lot of people's favorite, but I loved watching the progression of a young Snow kind of coming into like
evil Snow.
Yes. Of like understanding why he became what he is. But underneath Snow as the overarching villain, you have Coin in the third book, who is the leader of District 13. And then you go on to find she's going to do a lot of the same things. She just wants to be in power. And I love that as a story of being a villain, because the bullied becomes the bully. And I just think that's such an interesting phenomenon to witness, because when you give somebody who has been bullied power, they're full of anger and resentment, and they will turn it. And so I really like Coin as a villain.
One series that we've talked about a decent amount, and I guess I blurted it out before, is Fourth Wing. There's a couple different villains in Fourth Wing.
Yes.
Right? We've got the entity that is the Venom.
Yeah.
And the general or whatever. And then you have Jack Barlow.
That son of a bitch.
Son of a bitch. He is the worst. And I've seen the funniest memes about like a nuclear warhead and Jack Barlow's still alive.
He's like a cockroach.
He's like a cockroach. But also Varish is probably one of my top, like he's the Umbridge in that situation, of just like worst villains ever.
I think what Varish brings to the table that Dolores does not is kind of like the insanity. Like
the unhinged.
He is just like so unpredictable. Like as I was doing research and stuff, like one of the best villains of all time is Heath Ledger's Joker.
Yeah.
Because of his unpredictability. You don't know what is coming. You have no idea what he's plotting and planning. He's going to be talking to you and then suddenly he's just going to shove a pencil through somebody's head.
Yep.
Like you just don't know what's coming. And that was what I got from Varish. And honestly, Varish was one of the points of Iron Flame that I loved. He just like makes you want to like scream because you're just like, what are you going to do next?
Yep, that's true.
But I just thought he was spectacular in that. And I've been trying to think all day of like, who is that villain that's just like unhinged, insane? Like they are just evil for the sake of evil. And it's just fun to them. Varish, 100% Varish.
And his dragon. I thought it was a little weird that the dragon was
one-eyed dragon. Psycho.
Another one was Midas from Glint. So
Midas?
the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy is one of my all-time favorites. It's the story of King Midas told from like a fantasy perspective, but Midas is he's the bad guy in these books. He is the charismatic villain. And honestly, what a true depiction of like a toxic relationship, of a manipulative relationship, of a abusive relationship, that even in the modern day, like it really applied well to a modern day setting. Kind of reminded me a little bit of, and I haven't read the book, but I'm just going off of what I saw in the movie, but Colleen Hoover's It Ends With Us, like the charismatic abusive.
Yes. You're very much a fly on the wall and you can see the manipulation and it from the get-go, you're just like, oh, I get it. Like he's charming, but the emotional manipulation is just...
And the gaslighting. Ooh. I hate gaslighting.
Another example of a really charismatic villain is in Grady Hendrix's The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires.
Okay.
The villain in that, he gives Ted Bundy.
Ooh.
Just like Ted Bundy, I've got to be careful how I say this because I'm not saying that he was handsome. But
I mean, Zac Efron played him.
That was something that like was said back then. Like he was handsome, he was charming. Like you saw him and he was just not what you'd expect.
Getting that vibe.
In that book, it's just like he was... The other villain in that book, though, are the women's husbands because they're just terrible. And that
awful.
That also is a very interesting commentary on like 1990s culture.
Okay.
But anyways,
I haven't read that book.
Very charming. You need to read it. I think it's like one thriller spooky that I really liked. I think because of its deeper tones and themes.
Okay.
Like it's more than just like a vampire book. It's like there's some really interesting
Twilight?
commentary there. Complex villains of like they think that they're doing what's right, but
It's not
are they
really?
or you're just you as you learn a bit more about them as the books go on or as the series continues. The Lord Ruler from Mistborn, very interesting, very complex, there's a lot happening there.
When I first read Mistborn, because you don't see the Lord Ruler for a little bit, right? Not until
he's kind
the
of
very
like
end.
he's kind of like this entity.
Yeah. I got the Wizard of Oz vibes, like just this floating head.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Yes, kind of vibes, but yeah.
Yeah, so the Lord Ruler's another really interesting villain. Believes what he's doing is for the greater good, kind of a thing.
I guess Coin would be like into that.
Yeah.
In that category.
This is kind of an interesting one, but I've been thinking about this book a lot lately. Star Wars has some really great novels that are considered canon. And there's one that takes place in between The Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens.
I didn't even know they were books.
Okay. There's some really good ones. One of those is Lost Stars by Claudia Gray. I think I'm going to reread this book because I like it so much. I think I've read it twice. But Thane and Sienna are two friends that had dreams of being pilots. Okay. So I believe they were kids like before A New Hope, because you're taken through A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and then stuff that happens before The Force Awakens.
Okay.
And so they're both taken into the Empire. Spoiler alert if you haven't read Lost Stars. But they're both taken into the Empire, and then after Darth Vader uses the Death Star against Alderaan, Thane defects.
Okay.
So then you have these two best friends that are on two sides of a war that both think what they're doing is right. And of course, like the overarching villain is the Empire, but you have these two best friends who love each other that are torn apart by a war. And just victims of their experience. But just a little plug, if you like Star Wars, DM me because I have some good novels for you. There's some really good ones out there.
And they're not like fanfics.
No,
they're like
they're canon compliant, like truly like written by
like in the series, like blessed by Disney. I don't know.
Yeah, like basically like I don't know if authors come to them and like talk about their idea, or if I know there's certain authors that they like to work with, but they're literally like there's a list of novels that are canon. So they pair up with the books.
Okay.
Pair up with the movies, I mean.
You asked me about my favorite villain at the beginning of the episode, right? I would say there are some villains that I liked their backstory. Not necessarily like I liked it as in it was a great backstory, but just the fact that they had one and was a complex character. And Arobin from Throne of Glass is one of those for me.
Yeah.
Because at first he was a little like on the charming side, right? And then you get to see his manipulative ways, and then like you kind of can see a little bit more of like his true nature, and that he was a very complex villain to me. That intrigued me way more than Maeve did.
Yes, that I agree. And I think that's one reason why Queen of Shadows shined so much, was because of all of its dealings with Arobin and the background that they all had with Arobin.
What do you think makes a good villain?
Complexity.
Okay, I agree.
There has to be complexity. There has to be nuance. There has to be, a good villain is 100% convinced that what they're doing is the right thing to do.
There's some books out there that I've read, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, of course, but there are some that the villain sometimes will second guess what they're doing. Actually, I can't think of one off the top of my head. It is one of the villains in The Road of Bones, does a villainry thing and then second guesses it. So the complexity is I think really crucial in good storytelling. If you were a villain, I have a hard time picturing you as a villain. You're just so nice.
I don't know. Depends on if I'm menstruating or not.
The menses.
The menses.
If you were the villain, what would be like your thing?
Like my calling card? Or just like...
Would you be unhinged? Would you be charming? Would you be...
I think I'd probably be unhinged. Like if I were gonna be a villain, I think I would just go all out and just be horrible. for no reason.
For no reason
And then
whatsoever.
I'd cry in a back room later with my dog.
You're just petting your dog. They said I was mean.
And they're right. What about you?
Probably be like Gollum. I'd be like this.
Let's be honest, if I'm going to be a victim, it's because it's a victim of circumstance.
Oh my gosh.
You either die the hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
That's like how I would be. I feel like there would be one catalyst that'd be like, I'm no longer being nice to anyone. If you need me, I will now
My
be.
villain origin story probably starts with unnecessary phone calls that could have been text messages.
I do that to you.
No.
I literally called you to talk about a book.
That is not necessary. That is necessary. There are just certain times the conversation over the phone is easier and more effective, especially if you're talking about a book that might be the person who you're calling's favorite book.
Yes.
It's important. Those things are important.
Those priorities.
Priorities.
I feel like I want to say I would be like Bane from Batman.
Born in the Dark.
Born in the Dark. I would just be like, F the world. Like, I'm going to do my badass self.
Total annihilation.
Annihilation.
Just go for it.
Yeah. Let's be real. I'd be Bowser from Mario. That's
making people marry you.
Yes. Luckily,
100%.
I already did. But
we want to know what your favorite villains are, who your favorite villains are, why you love them, and what kind of villain you would be.
If villains had a dating profile, what would be the thing that makes you swipe right?
You got to read the Voldemort one because that's one of the most unhinged things I've ever seen in my life.
I made that up. Oh my gosh. Okay.
You made that up?
I made that up.
Vanessa, this is why we're friends. You're brilliant.
Okay. So we talked a lot about Umbridge, right? So the one I wrote for Umbridge was cozy vibes and can make a mean pot of tea.
You know her tea slaps.
Yeah. Cat friendly. The one for Voldemort was... I can't even say it. Allergy friendly because he has no hair.
It's not a hypoallergenic villain. Oh my gosh.
Voldemort, the hypoallergenic villain. I can't even say
Sauron could be like warm and cozy. Warm and cozy nights by the fire.
We'll give you jewelry. Oh, Snow. Snow could be
flowers for
flowers.
days.
We'll bring you flowers.
Always
up for flowers.
Arabin,
luscious hair.
Luscious hair.
He's always got like the best looking hair.
Luscious hair and can fund your lifestyle.
Can fund your lifestyle, but he makes them pay him back.
The villain in Lessons in Chemistry can be keeping things the same since 1960.
Love it.
Villains. We love our villains. They're necessary. They're wonderful. Sometimes they're dark and handsome. We're here for it.
We see you, Ben Barnes.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the To Be Read podcast. Remember, books are for everyone. Books are for you. And we'll catch you next week. Bye.